the mystifying title of this presentation really covers an issue which is so banal as to bordering to the insignificant, but that sometimes you have to wait long until you see what's really in front of your eyes. Yesterday, as some of you may recall, I gave a short primer of Peirce's theory of propositions and his notion of assertion. Today, I shall add an observation on how propositions are presented in the wild, outside of formalized languages. Here you have formalized propositions saying that all balls are red, but typically this is not the way we encounter propositions in semiotic real life in the wild. Here, in the wild, my claim was that it's important that the subject part of the proposition and the predicate part of the proposition are presented in proximity somehow. I call it co-localization. If they are not so presented, the interpreter will not be able to fuse them into one proposition. Of course, there may, as Peirce and Frege before him realized, there may be several subjects connected to one and the same predicate. Here we have another version of the Andreas Achenbach illustration which Peirce referred to, and that gives you the idea that co-localization may function as a sort of case grammar. Again, as you can see, A. Aschenbach is given as the title of the artwork here. Following a convention in European art, the name of the artist is given, one Dauthage, and down here the printer and the publisher's names are given. And my very, very banal point here is just that in order to constitute a proposition, these names have to be juxtaposed with the predicate which is, of course, the portrait of the German landscape painter Achenbach. So in a certain sense, that's so banal as to escape notice, really. You can see that two of these four names are conventionalized. It's a convention. If you have a portrait, then the name appearing directly under the portrait is typically the name of the person portrayed, right? And as I said, the name in one of the lower corners will typically be the name of the artist. So these are sort of conventions. The other two names then are not conventionalized. There's no convention saying that the printer should be in the lower left corner, right? And for that same reason, their roles are made explicit. It says printed by blah, 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 published by blah, blah, blah. So when it's not conventionalized, you have explicitly to add the role. But I would say that in principle, this is a bit like what's going on in linguistic case grammar, that these four names, they have different roles in relation to this predicate. And in a certain sense, they constitute four propositions. This portrait shows Achenbach. This portrait was drawn by Dauthage. This portrait was published by Eckstein, and this portrait was printed by Schilling. So, of course, you may synthesize all of these into one proposition, saying something like, this print portrays Achenbach. It was drawn by Dauthage. It was published by Eckstein and printed by Schilling. So these four names assume different roles in relation to this common predicate. So this example just goes to show that there may be a number of subjects adjoined to a predicate, and these subjects may play different case roles in relation to the predicate, as it were. The fact that these things occur on the same surface, I think, is the banality which I would like to draw your attention to in this presentation. And I think a way to do that is referring to this area on which they all appear as a sheet of assertion. Of course, that's a technical notion that Peirce developed in his so-called existential graphs. That was a logic formalism that Peirce developed in the late 90s, early 1900s, as an alternative to the linear logic formalization that he developed in the 1880s. You know, Peirce was really the father of modern formal logic as we know it today. It was he who developed the syntax. Frege had the same ideas, but nobody really used his formalization. But in this second round of logic formalization, Peirce had the idea that the empty sheet, the blank slate, as it were, the white page, it could be conceptualized as a sheet of assertion containing potentially all the true propositions about the relevant universe of discourse, and where conjunction and, you know, saying P and Q was realized very simply by just placing two propositions in the same area of the sheet. And my idea is now that something similar takes place in the wild. If we take a look at what Peirce did with propositional logic in the alpha graph version of the existential graphs, then his very, very simple basic idea was that logical conjunction uniting two propositions by means of and was simply representable by placing signs of the two propositions in proximity of each other, like the R and the S here. I have skewed them a little in order to show that this is not a linear formalism. They do not have to be on the same line as in his first formalization. So this complex here simply means R and S, logically speaking. Logical disjunction R or S is then represented in this way by means of negation. The ovals here represent negation. So this means it is not the case that not R and not S, which is the same thing that R or S. So that's just the basic machinery of the alpha graphs. This is not so important, just to give you the idea of what he's after. I mean, this is the important thing in my argument here. Another interesting thing here is that first, when devising this around 1896, Peirce also toyed with the opposite notation in his so-called entitative graphs system, where this sign here was to be interpreted as disjunction. And for a lot of reasons, he ended up preferring this interpretation, that the juxtaposition of two propositions is equivalent to their conjunction, not to their disjunction. Of course, the dual system would also be possible, but Peirce left that because of the fact that he thought that taking conjunction as the primitive was the more iconic solution. And that you can see from his beta graphs, which is first order predicate logic, which is based on the alpha graphs. You find the same thing. You find the negation circles or ovals. But here, of course, as you do in predicate logic in general, he's interested in analyzing the interior composition of propositions. So this sign here in beta graphs means it is not the case that there exists somebody who does not blame somebody to somebody. So these three lines called identity lines, they refer to individuals. They are sort of the subject signs here, and of course blames to is the predicate. The other end of identity lines may also use to identify the individual. So this sign here means Adam blames Eve, which he certainly did. And finally, you could add that the outermost end of a identity line indicates the quantification, logically speaking, so of the relevant individual. I'm not going very deeply into that. Just to give you the idea that is from here, I got my idea that sheets of assertion may play an important role in science in the wild. First, predicate logic. Here I would say that oftentimes in the wild, we actually find spontaneous identity lines. So, for instance, in this anatomical diagram, giving you a cross-cut of the upper part of the human body, and these identity lines, they give the names of the relevant body parts. Here you have the diaphragm, here you have the trachea, and so on and so forth. What's interesting me here, of course, is not human anatomy, but the use of these lines. You can see they are sort of identity lines in the wild, as it were. And I think particularly in complicated empirical diagrams, where it's important to identify many parts, you very often find such identity lines in the wild. In other cases, you can have the co-localization of predicate and subject without such identity lines. For instance, in the Achenbach portrait that I just showed you. And so how are such sheets in the wild defined? I mean, very often there's no borderline. I mean, this diagram doesn't have a frame or anything like that, but we sort of spontaneously know that all of it sort of refers to the same object, right? Even if there are lots of different subject signs here, the trachea, the thymus, and so on and so forth, we spontaneously know that because it's one synthetic diagram, it refers to one and the same object. So here a frame is not needed, but oftentimes frames are needed in order to signal that what appears inside this frame refers to the same object. I mean, it's really as simple as that. I mean, that's my main point here in this short presentation. Could be indicated, of course, by drawn lines or frames, could be indicated by literal physical frames like in old paintings, could also indirectly be signaled by the similarity in font style or in design. I have some examples of that. Here's a example coming from a recent interest I had in the Danish press freedom period in the 18th century. This is a broadsheet print that was for sale, and it shows the execution of the guy who introduced press freedom in Denmark. It was not so popular to do things like that, so he was executed outside of Copenhagen, and here you can see his body parts being taken down after execution. But the reason why I brought it here is that it is an example of this co-localization, because here you have the image predicate, could be any execution, right? But here you have text functioning as the subject part of this whole proposition, because it names the guy Struensee, who was decapitated outside of Copenhagen, and indicates the date that it happens. So here you have a sort of predicate and subject, and the important thing here is that they are connected because they are given inside of the same frame, so we know that they refer to the same thing, right? You can also take book covers. Here we sort of pass to the co-localization, not of predicate and subject, but the co-localization of propositions, like in AlphaGraphs. Here you have a famous book from recent decades, and here I think the book cover functions as a sort of sheet of assertion. These names are sort of labels directly attached to the subject that they refer to, namely the book. So these propositions express something like that. This book is written by J.K. Rowling, and it has the title Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and it was published by Bloomsbury. I mean, it's so banal, but the fact that these informations occur in the same sheet of assertion grants for us that they refer to one and the same thing, which is the book in question. I have a funny example here from the age of Enlightenment, where you have false propositions that say that that's the original cover of Spinoza's famous and infamous Tractatus Theologico-Politicus of 1670, arguably one of the most important early tracts of radical enlightenment. And of course, just as with the Harry Potter thing, this sheet claims the proposition. This book is a copy of the Tractatus, so on and so forth, with its long subtitle here. Other signs, linguistically unconnected to the title, float in this same 2D space of the sheet. So as, for instance, the printer's name is given as one Künrad, and the city of publication Hamburg. So they make this propositional claim that this book was printed by Künrad in Hamburg. That's a proposition to you. Both of these claims, of course, are false. Spinoza wrote in a period when there was immediate danger connected to expressing such political viewpoints. I mean, he spoke for democracy and freedom of speech and things like that. Church didn't like that. So he didn't wish to be persecuted like it had happened with some of his friends. So he made the printer lie on the title page. We now know it's a recent research result, really, that it was really printed by one Israel de Paul in Amsterdam, but he considered it too dangerous to admit that. But here you can see again this 2D area here functions as a sheet of assertion with a number of propositions on it, some true and some false. Posters typically constitute sheets of assertion with conjunction. Here you have a classical movie poster, Gone with the Wind, and implicit lines of identity connect the names of the authors here with portraits of them appearing in their roles, and the role names are also given down here. So, so there's a lot of propositions going on here. Also, that it was produced by Selznick. It was based by the novel of Margaret Mitchell. The film is showing twice daily, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of propositions here. But my point here is that we know that all of these propositions pertain to the same movie because they are printed in the same 2D sheet of assertion, as it were. So again, that's my very simple claim. And I think this is my last example here, going a bit into what we discussed with the irony and satire yesterday. It's a recent example of a political poster connected to the American presidential election a year ago. It reads, "Acting in concert, Putin and the Pussy Grabbers." And here you have this famous band. You have Donald Trump donning his Elvis costume, and you have Vladimir Putin here wielding his guitar. And here you have a lot of support bands, including Susie Q Anon and the Roger Stones and such famous bands. And they are appearing on a farewell freedom tour with the date of November the 3rd, which was of course the date of the American presidential election. And of course, all of these things constitute false propositions. I mean, there's no such tour. The two never appeared as a pop duo on stage together, and so on and so forth. But my theoretical claim here is that the reason why we are able to read this as a consistent satire, again, is that all of these false propositions appear on the same 2D surface and so are taken to refer to the same state of things as Peirce would call it. Of course, the idea you easily get that all of these propositions here are false. Gives you the idea that they should probably be read on some other level than direct reference, and that's of course what prompts the satirical reading of it. But my point is just that even the satirical reading presupposes that all of these propositions on the surface refer to one and the same thing, namely the presidential election. Right? This is my very last slide, because then my overall claim is that typically, but not always, but typically in sheets in the wild, signs are analyzed as conjunctions. I mean, if you have a shopping list, there's a conjunction between the claims that you should buy these things. I mean, if you come back to your wife or your husband saying, I read the list you gave me and I bought some hot dogs, then your spouse will say, but what about the milk and the eggs and the butter? But I just picked one of them. I mean, you would not do that. In a shopping list, the idea is that you should buy every single item. So there's an implicit and between these words, right? So I would say that is the typical one. It's not the only one. If you have menus, you of course know that they are typically composed by disjunction. You should buy either this item or that item or that item or that item. Of course, if you are very hungry, you can buy all of them. But typically, this is a conjunction list, and this is a disjunction list. You can also find other logical relations expressed in sheets in the wild. For instance, implication may be given by before or after pictures. Of course, in this case, there's a missing premise, namely, what was it that gave this guy his hair back? So you are interested in finding this missing premise, and you can have notions of negation like this one. But my main claim that even if you find such cases with disjunction and implication and negation, the typical use of sheets of assertion in the wild out there is conjunction, that you imply without saying it the logical notion of conjunction when you try to fuse the different information of the sheet of assertion. That was it.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Fredrik. Thanks very much, Fredrik. Something really kind of occurs to me, you know, I am convinced and persuaded by your mention of colocalization. And it's apparent to me now, would you say that one of the reasons for which we are so prone to propose incorrectly causality is because colocalization is such a strong meaning-making criteria that you know, we often suppose ad hoc propter hoc because for environmental survival reasons, it's safe to suppose that colocalization implies that two propositions are part of the same argument.
Yeah, might be. I have to reflect more upon that, but I do see your idea. I mean, it's what sociologists used to refer to by saying that correlation is not the same thing as causation, right? Because obviously predicate and subject are correlated, but there's no need to assume there's a causality relation between them. So of course that is an exaggerated interpretation of such a sign to assume there's a causality relation. But I mean, whether there's a causality relation is an empirical fact. I mean, you have to look at the world in order to establish that. I mean, you cannot establish that only by looking at the sign, right?
Thank you.
Yes, question over there. Can you go?
Thank you very much for your talk. And I was thinking, I work with a lot of designers, and it's very common among them to talk about some Gestalt principles. And those Gestalt principles are in general conceptual organization, similarity, continuity, closure. And I was thinking, do you think that those Gestalt principles can be considered sheets of the session in the phenomenological aspect?
I think you're right that graphical designers typically know this. I mean, they may not make it the object of an explicit theory or anything like that, but I've seen all skilled graphical designers know this. They know that if they place signs with a truth value on the same surface, then it will typically amount to the conjunction of those propositions. I certainly think. I mean, all designers of book covers know that. Now I have a daughter who's a graphical designer. She's designing book covers, and she has never heard about this theory, but still she knows implicitly these principles. So I think you are quite right that graphic designers work by these principles. But I mean, that's just the same thing as to say that you do not necessarily have any explicit knowledge of the grammar of your native tongue. I mean, you can speak your native tongue without explicitly knowing anything about grammar, right? So I think it's a sort of the same sort of implicit knowledge there.
Thank you. That's fascinating. At the same time, I wonder whether your hypothesis somehow makes sense because the contents that you present in your sheets are conjunctive.
Yeah, it's an argument by examples.
Or going to the female toilet and going to the male toilet that appear exactly on the same door, on the same sheet at the entrance of the toilet. So that's disjunctive and the same frame. So, because the content is disjunctive. So the frame actually doesn't act as a conjunctive framework with the contents.
But I would say if you see the stylized man and the stylized woman and an arrow, you will get the idea that both the toilet for men and the toilet for women is in this direction, right?
Yeah, exactly. But in that case, you are introducing an element that turns that content into a conjunctive content. But if you don't place the arrow and the content stays disjunctive, then that frame with the content means left side for men and the right side for women, even without an arrow.
Yeah, but why would that not be a conjunction?
Well, because it implies two different pragmatic choices.
Of course, but I mean, now I didn't have so much time, but in a certain sense, I addressed that issue in the middle paragraph here, because I would say that in certain cases, sheets exist which are neutral as to the distinction between conjunction and disjunction. I mean, for instance, if you see an overview, that's my example here. If you see an overview of university departments, then it can be read as a conjunctive list saying this university consists of this department and this department and this department and this department. But if you read it with another habit intention, I mean, habits for actions are important as final interpreters of science in person, then you can read it as a disjunction list, namely saying I could either go to the Department of Biology or to the Department of Physics or to the Department of Philosophy or to the Department of Comparative Literature. So in a certain sense, such a list would be neutral as to the conjunction disjunction distinction. So I'm certain. I mean, that's what this slide goes to show. I mean, I'm not claiming that all such sheets have conjunction as their basic notion. I'm just saying that typically it is conjunction, but there are other possibilities. There's, I mean, like the menu and the other examples.
The power of the frame.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that could be my title here. The power,
Historically,
the power of the frame.
I mean, it doesn't originate. There is a beautiful book by interested kids about invention of painting. If you look at this room, for instance, you find the frame over there,
Yeah,
and that is very easy to read in conjunctive method because that is a ornament of painting that was born with the frame.
yeah,
But if you look at the fresco, it's very difficult to understand where it starts, where it ends.
yeah,
Because it's a technique of presentation that predates the invention of the frame. And the same for sheets, sheets are not the only support for writing. They were predated by other forms of writing that would not stay in the frame, like historical carving or even epigraphs or the.
yeah. I think cave paintings typically don't have a frame, right? But I think frames are pretty early. I mean, you have frames in ancient Egypt, right? And you, as far as I know, it's also a sort of cross-cultural thing. I mean, you have frames in China, you have frames in the Mesoamerican culture. So it's not a specifically Western thing with frames. Probably they were invented independently. Because it's
we continue discussion, and I think that they got more precise with modernity because
certainly
the individualization.
Certainly.
I think we're borrowing 2 minutes from our next speaker. So
Yeah, there are last questions, but we're out of time.
oh, okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Costello.
Welcome.